We have all these kind of arguments about how we avert the perfection of AI from a plausible sentence generator into a paperclip maximizing superintelligence. But we don't talk about what do we do about the decision support systems that decide who's entitled to benefits, whose children get taken away by child protective services, who's entitled to subsidized housing, who's entitled to cash bail, where the police should deploy and police people, whose face matches a profile of faces that are considered suspicious.
Cory Doctorow, welcome back to How the Light Gets In.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back.
Fantastic. So, you've obviously had this immensely long and successful career as a science fiction author, and your most recent book, Red Team Blues, also centres around modern technology. And I guess my first question I wanted to ask is, how did you manage to kind of integrate these really, really advanced technological concepts in a way that's really accessible to readers, but it's also integral to the plot of the book?
Well, I think that's kind of my my deal, is figuring out how to make science fiction plots where the actual limitations and capabilities of technology are the crux of the plot rather than an inconvenience to be maneuvered around. You know, there's a kind of techno-thriller where there's just a kind of like insert nonsense here way to set up problems for the characters, where we have to crack the mainframe and breaking the encryption takes 11 minutes, but we've only got 10 minutes. We're just going to have to nerd harder. And, you know, I think that there just comes a point where it lacks verisimilitude and salience. It's a bit like going to watch a Western and maybe you don't count how many bullets the 6-gun fires, but at the point where the horse starts flying, you're like, I don't think horses can do that. So I've been involved in tech policy fights for 20 some years, and I've been a blogger for just as long. And blogging is this process whereby everything that seems like it is part of a bigger story, even if you don't know where it fits in, you write up whatever it was that caught your attention for an audience of notional strangers. And in so doing, you fix it in your own memory and you clarify it for yourself. And you end up with a kind of just like a big raft of facts and oddments at your disposal, a kind of supersaturated solution of fragments of ideas that are perennially like nucleating and crystallizing. And then you also have the blog itself, which is a literal database that you can search to find out what you previously had thought about some subject. So this novel, it's a cryptocurrency heist novel. It draws very heavily on the critiques of cryptocurrency that I and others have been involved with for a couple of years. Those fights have been very bruising. A lot of the people involved in cryptocurrency say things that rhyme with the things that I care about: decentralization, anti-authoritarianism, resistance to censorship. But the mechanism whereby they hope to attain it, I find both economically and technologically incoherent. And having those arguments with people I often agree with has been really something. It's one thing to win an argument with someone you dislike, but winning an argument with someone you like is actually no fun at all. I also drew on some technical ideas that I've been working with for now more than 20 years. The idea about something called remote attestation, which is when your computer can tell third parties who don't trust you what it's doing in such a way that they trust what the computer is saying. So like maybe you and a friend want to play a video game and you want to assure them that you're not running a cheat on your computer. Remote attestation would allow your computer to do this. It's also a way that if you rent cloud space on a server, you can ask the server how it's configured and make sure that the people who run it aren't spying on you or sabotaging your work. But it's also a way that like your boss can make you run surveillanceware on your computer in a way that's very hard for you to defeat without them knowing about it. It's a way that, say, the government of Iran could insist that every computer in the country be equipped so that it can know how it's configured. And this is something that I've been quite alarmed about for 20 years, but is like so esoteric and weird that it's very hard to get other people to care about it. And, you know, Bruce Sterling, when he reviewed my novel Walkaway, he said that a lot of my fiction consists of me building up and demolishing arguments that no one except me has ever advanced. And I think that that's what I'm doing in this book. And to the extent that I'm making these concepts more accessible than they have been historically, or that I've managed historically. Some of that, I think, is down to us being in a world in which these concepts are a little more familiar. Like, we all know that our iPhones are designed to stop us from installing software that we want if Apple doesn't want us to have it. And so we've got this sense that we have devices that are loyal to someone other than their owners. But also, with practice comes perfection. That, having made these arguments now for 20 years and having confronted the blank stares of people who I've left behind me as I raced ahead of them, talking a spittlefleck mile a minute, I've identified the weak spots and shored them up somewhat. And then when you package them in fiction and you make them the crux of a story about a likable character trying to solve a relatable problem, I think it propels this explanation in a way that it wouldn't if it were just a technical explanation.
What people are being presented with and what you're sort of championing, it doesn't seem like an immediate threat.
Sure.
And it's also, you have to sort of toy up in a way the kind of utilitarian aspect of, I'm being provided this service, and really I'm not mandated to kind of critique it because, I don't care if I'm being spied on, I've got nothing to hide.
Sure.
But then that notion is really, really worrying. I wanted to talk a little bit specifically about the character Marty Hench, and I wanted to ask sort of how you managed to develop this unique kind of blend of a traditional kind of thriller hero character, but obviously with these sort of 21st century skills, how you go about the process of kind of melding those two together.
Sure, yeah. So Marty Hench, he's a 67-year-old forensic accountant who's been in Silicon Valley for 40 years unwinding the most eye-watering Baroque finance bro scams that you can imagine. He's seen it all and he's ready to retire, and he gets called out for one last job, as the trope goes. And in the traditional noir thriller, the hero is a cop who will do things the cops can't do, right? They'll break into the warehouse and find the things that you can't find because you can't get a warrant. They'll slap around the suspect in a way that the cops couldn't, and so on. And by the time you get to the end of the book, one of the things that is the motif of the hard-boiled private eye is his realization that a lot of the things that the cops supposedly couldn't do were actually things they wouldn't do. That the cops just weren't all that interested in rooting out corruption. It's Chinatown, Jake. And Marty is a different kind of cop. He's a revenuer. He's basically an unlicensed IRS agent, and he's going through the same realizations. Someone called this book Panama Papers fanfic. And, when you read the Panama Papers and you read the really excellent coverage that came out of that leak and Paradise Papers and ProPublica's IRS files and so on, one of the things that becomes very clear is that these supposedly genius things that these enablers come up with for offshore billionaires to duck their taxes are really just sort of performatively complex, that there's not a lot of there, that they're not hard to understand because they're complex so they'll be hard to understand. And a lot of it is just like doing the same thing over and over again in a loop. Like, okay, we took your money and we put it in a Scottish trust, and then we made the Scottish trust's officers numbered companies in Guernsey, and then we made the officers of the numbered companies in Guernsey new Scottish trusts. And you look at this and you're like, so if you're not convinced that just having the money in a Scottish trust is secure because someone can pierce the veil of anonymity there, so you've put them inside Guernsey numbered companies and you think Guernsey secrecy will protect you, what is putting the Guernsey companies inside Scottish trusts get you? Didn't we say 2 steps ago that we don't think Scottish trusts are themselves robust enough? And the conclusion that I end up reaching is, on the one hand, someone who's arranging these affairs for rich monsters is just jacking up their billings. But on the other hand, that the revenue doesn't give a shit, right? Like all they want is plausible deniability. And we've had all this fuss over the last couple of years about defunding the police and how this is such a terrible idea. We defunded the police 40 years ago with Margaret Thatcher. We defunded the people who inspect workplaces to see if they're safe, who inspect the tail end of exhaust pipes and the smokestacks to make sure that they're not murdering us. We defunded the police that make sure rich people aren't cheating on their taxes. Like, we defunded all the police that matter. There's far more wage theft than burglaries, both in total monetary figures and in frequency. Those cops aren't on the beat and haven't been And the ones who are left are the kind of demoralized, weak sister cops that are the trope of every hard-boiled detective novel, where the detective meets the cop who's like, well, what do you expect me to do? And they turn their nose up and they go, I'm going to go and solve this crime. And that's who Marty Hench is. He's the 67-year-old forensic accountant who's seen it all and understands that the IRS is not doing its job, not because they can't, but because they won't.
I wanted to go back to the point you made sort of about obfuscation being this kind of tactic of, we'll make it as complex as possible and then people will sort of give up in light of it. And it's the same kind of when you're offered sort of the same tactics with these tech monopolies, and terms and conditions will sort of bury them in complexity, and you're sort of up against this monolith. You argued kind of in choke point capitalism that we've kind of entered this new era of exploitative business practices. How much of it is exploitative business practices and how much of it is it just ineffective antitrust regulation?
Well, I think that you can't separate market concentration from bad regulation. So you can think about regulation as being like a kind of truth-seeking exercise. Like, we want to know, is it okay to put raw sewage in the water, right? This is an actual question that we need to know the answer to, and it has a factual basis. And if the people who are interested in dumping raw sewage in the water are a big, diverse sector with hundreds of firms, none of which dominate, and the regulator convenes a truth-seeking exercise. They put out, in the United States, it would be a notice of inquiry or notice of rulemaking. Here it would be a similar kind of inquiry from a ministry. And they say, please send us your submissions and tell us what you think. You would get a diversity of replies, and you would get replies to the replies. You would get people saying, this company says it's fine to have turds in the drinking water, nothing bad's going to happen. Let us tell you why our company's solution is better. We have far fewer turds in the drinking water, and you should be favoring our processes over our competitors. But when a sector dwindles to 4 or 5 giant firms, they solve the collective action problem of not arguing in front of the referee, right? All those arguments take place in the smoke-filled room beforehand. They converge on a set of priorities, and then they all show up and talk with the same voice. And yes, academics and activists and so on, they speak as well, but the rebuttal to them is like, how many water systems are you running? Right? And you don't know what you're talking about. You see this a lot with network neutrality, where you have all the telecoms people come together and say, actually, what people really want is for their internet service provider to deliver the bits that the ISP's shareholders would prefer you to have asked for, rather than the ones that you actually want. And there's some sort of revealed preference where people actually prefer this. You get it a lot in privacy, right? Why would people sign away their privacy if they didn't not value their privacy, right? And there are some pretty easy rebuttals, like Apple added a one-click opt-out of surveillance on iOS devices. 96% of Apple users click that box. The other 4% presumably either work for Facebook or were confused, right? But even so, regulators have a hard time building up the evidentiary basis. And so the failure to enforce competition law, to block mergers, to block predatory conduct like predatory pricing. Uber lit $30 billion of Saudi oil money on fire over 12 years in order to drive taxi businesses out of business, stall public transit, and create the illusion that you could pay drivers enough money to lure them out of other forms of employment, and yet charge riders so little that they would prefer to ride in these cars, losing 41 cents on every dollar that they brought in for more than a decade. And so I think it's dead in the water. There's new legislation before Parliament to give the long overdue secondary enforcement powers to the Digital Markets Unit. So under the coalition government, there was legislation passed to charter the largest technical unit of any competition regulator in the world underneath the Competition Markets Authority. It's called the DMU, 70 full-time engineers on the public payroll, but they never passed the secondary legislation giving them enforcement powers. So for years, this group of very talented, very smart engineers have been pulling apart these baroque scams like the ad tech market, the mobile market, and so on, and writing these bangers of reports, like 400-page long, extremely readable, very good reports unwinding these scams. You know, there's a term in finance, MIGO, which stands for my eyes glaze over, and it's when you sort of wrap things in so much complexity that people assume that they're substantive, like a pile of shit big enough has to have a pony underneath it, and these guys are just shredding it. Now, without enforcement powers, there wasn't much they could do here. The European Union, on the other hand, has a real poverty of engineers, but a lot of enforcement powers. So they've been running with it. But now we have legislation before Parliament that not only gives them these enforcement powers, but actually gives them the power to craft bespoke remedies for each sector and firm. So they can go in and they can say, like, the specific kind of fuckery that is Mark Zuckerbergian fuckery needs this remedy. And it's not the same thing we need for Google. And it's not the same thing we need for Snapchat or Oracle. And so they can draft effectively full-blown regulation for each of these firms to curb their most abusive conduct. So it's quite exciting. There is a moment all over the world for this stuff. You know, they say Stein's law is anything that can't go on forever eventually stops. And there is a real sense that we are at the end stage of how badly we're prepared to allow firms to conduct themselves, and that people of all stripes really want them to pull up their socks.
It does feel like we've had a sort of Damascene moment, and most people have become aware that there are these practices that are undercutting them as a consumer. And you've been an integral part of that in this way that you bring what is highly complex, highly technologically complex issues to light within science fiction. And you approach them in a way that doesn't feel didactic. And how I just wanted to try and understand how you sort of present these things in a way that doesn't feel, I'm sort of ramming this down your throat, because people need to be reawakened because these are things that are happening now.
Yeah, so this is back to this idea that you can approach the technical aspects of a storyline as inconveniences to work around, or as parameters to build the plot out of, right? And so, you know, there is a kind of heist story that goes, first we design the heist and then we figure out what they're stealing. And then there's the other kind that's like, first we figure out something interesting to steal and then we work backwards and make the heist up, which is how you would do it in an actual heist. This is why, you know, the Hatton Garden robbers are so interesting, right? Or there was a group of French robbers who, during one of their many bank holidays, tunneled into a bank vault and cleaned out all the safe deposit boxes. And there was evidence that they brought along a gourmet chef and they set up a canteen and they ate spectacular meals and sort of were very French about it. We all like these caper stories because they turn on something that is real and interesting, as opposed to something that is a contrivance and a hypothetical. And so, you know, in Red Team Blues, Marty Hench has to recover the missing cryptographic keys for an unwisely inserted backdoor in a cryptocurrency blockchain that will allow you to steal all the money in the blockchain. And he actually manages to recover the keys, but the people who stole them turn out to be gangsters who wanted to do money laundering, who were double-crossing another group of gangsters who wanted to do money laundering, and they both get angry at him. And so now he has to survive. And, you know, the idea that gangsters who do money laundering are incredibly violent and vicious is not a thing that you have to reach to very far to believe in. Nor that cryptocurrency's main use is to dress up money laundering in respectable clothes and pretend that it's just fintech. You know, whenever you hear fintech, think unlicensed bank.
We've also now had this sort of realization that cryptocurrency has been denuded of its kind of status of this sort of solution to, obviously the decentralization aspect was a really, really big kind of plus towards it. It's now fallen massively out of favor, I would say. Do you think that it's sort of been successful from pulling it from this sort of revered status in society?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, this idea that you don't understand it, but it's the next big thing, and if you don't get involved, you're gonna miss out. As the crypto bros had it, have fun being poor. Has in large part drawn down. I think that there were some people who are very susceptible to that rhetoric in the same way that there's some people who go and pull the lever on a fruit machine and just can't stop. And those people are continuing to pump real money into this funny money system. But I think a lot of the people involved have pivoted to saying AI is the next big thing.
Yeah, of course, I was going to say.
And, if you're not in AI, you're going to miss out, because eventually, if the chatbot makes sentences that are plausible enough, it will become a super intelligence, something, something, something profit.
And do you think it's an unfounded move? Because obviously they're drastically different.
Sure.
And there was this big joke that all of the crypto bros have now transformed overnight into AI bros.
Yeah.
They are drastically different. And I guess with artificial intelligence, you don't see it as any kind of meaningful threat in the same sense, or...
Oh, I think our bosses want to fire our asses and replace us with software.
Yeah.
Let's not, have any doubt about that. When Morgan Stanley says this is a $6 trillion opportunity, what they mean is we're going to put $6 trillion worth of workers on the breadline. But our bosses don't give a shit if the thing that they replace us with works. All they care is whether it's profitable. So think of every interactive voice response system that replaced a human operator that you've called and said, 17, no, 17, 17, 17, operator, operator, operator. So all they care about is that there's no competition that a customer can defect to if they're angry about the fact that some automation has been moved in that enshittified the service to the point where it's not worth using anymore, but it's the only game in town. That's the goal here, right? It's basically, think of it as being like the shops and services offered on the other side of the security checkpoint at an airport. They don't have to be good because they're the only thing going, right? And if you're stuck in a 16-hour layover because the airline has decided to cut its pilot staffing levels to the bone and someone got a cold and now the entire thing has been thrown into a state of higgledy-piggledy, you've got 17 hours and you're just going to be buying 11-pound bottles of water and giant bags of dairy milk and whatever at farcically inflated prices, because what else are you going to do? There's an old famous Lily Tomlin sketch where she plays a telephone operator and she turns to the camera and says, "We don't have to care, we're the phone company," right? And that's the goal here. So when you see Hollywood execs saying effectively, we want to fire all the screenwriters and replace them with plausible sentence generators, that's because even if the plausible sentence generators aren't very good, they have this weird hubristic faith in their ability to, through iteration, replace the screenwriter who wrote good dialogue with their own kind of wild-ass ideas. And the screenwriter's experience of getting notes from an executive is already just AI prompting, right? Like, I need you to write me a version of Indiana Jones, but in space. And could you make it a horror movie, but make the hero a 10-year-old girl, right? That is, your classic, executive to writer note. And then the writer makes it and they go, can you bring in a lovable animal in Act 2? This is just prompting, right? This is just write me instructions for removing a grilled cheese sandwich from a VCR in the style of the King James Bible, right? It's just prompting. And so, what you get with automation is not something that's good, but something that doesn't complain when you try to impose your genius on it. And it's ever been thus, right? We have this libel that the Luddites were anti-technology, and they were anything but, right? To be a skilled textile tradesperson in the early 19th century, you needed to do a 7-year apprenticeship. This is the equivalent of getting a master's degree in engineering from MIT, right? And their bosses built machines that made very low quality textiles, but were so easy that children could use them. And the point was that they could kidnap children from Napoleonic War orphanages in London, indenture them to 10 years of service in the dark satanic mills of Manchester, maim them, starve them, mutilate them, and kill them in the teeth of the machine, and make gigantic profits without having to do any kind of bargaining with their existing workforce and throw the workforce on the rubbish heap of history. That was what the Luddites objected to, right? To call the Luddites anti-machine is like calling Osama bin Laden anti-aviation, right? They said, the thing they were angry about was not the machines. There's a guy called Robert Blincoe who was indentured for 10 years and nearly killed and watched lots of other children killed. And he wrote a memoir when he finally escaped the factory, which was a national bestseller and inspired Dickens to write Oliver Twist. Oliver Twist was a thinly veiled documentary about working conditions, and specifically the working conditions the Luddites were angry about.
This replacement of highly skilled labour with something that's sort of permissible, scalable en masse. It's the same with something like ChatGPT.
Yeah.
And in a way, it's this sort of deferring of kind of this conscious awareness of a human being engaging in something. More and more of our society is becoming sort of underwritten by what's basically machine intelligence in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, so this is when we were talking before about like people giving warnings about technology and not being heeded. One of the complications about this is that oftentimes the warnings are self-serving nonsense, right? So, Facebook declared themselves to be evil sorcerers who'd figured out how to hack our dopamine loops when they were really just monopolists who were stealing from publishers and advertisers by just flooding the zone with bullshit. But they liked the idea that Robert Mercer was using their mind control ray to make your uncle into a QAnon, when your uncle was really just a racist gammon all along. And, by taking credit for this, they could go to the advertisers who said, why should we pay a 40% premium to advertise on Facebook? And they could say, haven't you heard, I'm an evil sorcerer who hacks dopamine loops. Your racist uncle? That was me, right? And so, a lot of these warnings, like we get warnings about AI that are like, AI is going to become super intelligent, and then it's going to decide to turn the world into paperclips. And we're all going to be deconstructed and reassembled as paperclips by the paperclip maximizing machine. And meanwhile, so we have all these kind of arguments about how we avert the perfection of AI from a plausible sentence generator into a paperclip maximizing superintelligence. But we don't talk about what do we do about the decision support systems that decide who's entitled to benefits, whose children get taken away by child protective services, who's entitled to subsidized housing, who's entitled to cash bail, where the police should deploy and police people, whose face matches a profile of faces that are considered suspicious.
We're already kind of facing these problems today. We are sort of seeing how certain systems produce certain outcomes that don't really benefit certain groups in any meaningful sense, but we have this inability to sort of work out where it went wrong.
I think that it's because certain explanations are out of scope. So when we think about things like the housing crisis, right? We ask ourselves, how can we solve the housing crisis without building more public housing? And so we come up with all these ways to sort of lure the animal sentiments of the market into building more housing. We say like more fireproof, more highly flammable cladding might do it, or we say tax breaks for people who buy to let might do it, or maybe we give people help to buy and drive up the price of every flat, or maybe if we put 5 shows on the BBC in which people buy and flip houses, somehow that will conjure more housing into being. And because we're not allowed to say, like, what if we just built more houses? In the same way that, whenever we talk about unsustainable wages, we always talk about training. We don't talk about minimum wages. And there's this kind of story that minimum wages crowd out jobs, and they prevent jobs from being created, and 0 hours contracts create the flexibility to create jobs. None of this bears empirical scrutiny, but it's so doctrinally ingrained that we're not allowed to ever consider it. And so we're left with why don't we try this other thing that is very implausible instead of the obvious thing that's
Why
right
do you think
here?
we avoid the obvious thing? Why don't you think there's more people just saying flat out?
Well, I think that we've had 40 years of being told that governments can't do anything and markets can do everything.
Do you think that we're going against this now? I think people are starting to see that markets just simply don't have...
Yeah, I think anything that can't go on eventually stops, and in particular, markets' ability to regulate the climate impacts of industrial production, which are literally driving us to the brink of extinction, have made people lose confidence. And every time we try to add markets, right, say carbon offsets, we create what economists call the market for lemons, where the carbon offsets that are the lowest quality and do the least to mitigate harm are the cheapest to make, and therefore become the ones that markets prefer. And so we end up with all of the carbon offsets just being nonsense, right? Being things like the Nature Conservancy buying forests that are already protected preserves and ineligible for logging, and then signing a declaration saying we'll never log this forest that we were already not allowed to log, and then minting a carbon offset. And then when the forest burns down in a wildfire, that carbon offset continues to circulate in the market, even though the forest doesn't even exist anymore. And whenever we see this, we're like, well, I guess, we need to try harder to make our carbon offsets more high quality. But at a certain point, we're like, actually, the problem is that the carbon offsets themselves just don't work. Maybe we need to just directly regulate what sort of things we can do. And, honestly, like, we are surrounded by the evidence of our capacity as a species to make good regulation, right? There are no microbiologists in Parliament, and yet you don't die of listeria every time you drink your tap water. Although we're headed that direction, right? And we're not headed that direction because the microbiologists who used to be in Parliament lost their seats, right? We're headed that direction because we've allowed market concentration to distort our capacity to make regulation. But making good water regulation, it's not like embalming pharaohs, right? It's a thing like there are people alive today who remember how we did it. We could do it again. We just need to curb that market concentration that makes it impossible to make good rules. So a good recent example of this is what happened when David Nutt was the czar, the drug czar. So in the UK, 2 companies control all the beer and 2 companies control all the spirits. He wrote a paper in which he said that cannabis was less harmful than alcohol, which is an empirical fact. Alcohol is an extremely dangerous drug. And Jackie Smith rang him up and said, you can't do this. She was the Home Secretary. You can't do this. You can't compare alcohol to cannabis. And he said, well, why not? And she said, well, because cannabis is illegal. And she said, well, why is it? And he said, well, why is it illegal? And she said, because it's harmful. And he said, but it's not as harmful as alcohol. She said, but you can't compare alcohol to cannabis. And he said, why not? And she said, well, because cannabis is illegal, right? This circular reasoning goes around and around. Meanwhile, the drinks industry, in their own internal communications, admits that all of their profit, all of their margin, comes from selling alcohol to binge drinkers, right, to people who drink unhealthily. They claim that they regret this fact. And so they have a self-regulated curriculum to try to discourage people from binge drinking, which is wildly ineffective. And when they're confronted with this fact, they say the reason it's wildly ineffective is because it's impossible to convince people not to binge drink. So David Nutt wrote a curriculum to discourage binge drinking and went and delivered it in a kind of randomized trial and determined that his curriculum worked and their curriculum didn't. The person who wanted to make good regulation was forced out, right? And so we can see that repeated in so many domains. And I think increasingly people are just unwilling to say that the answer to the machine is the machine, that if capitalism isn't working, we need more capitalism, that we just haven't made the market free enough for it to clear and produce these optimal outcomes.
What will your next book be about?
So my next book, I write when I'm anxious. I have 6 more books in production. My next book is coming from Verso in September. It's called The Internet Con, How to Seize the Means of Computation. And it's a big tech disassembly manual. It's a set of detailed policy prescriptions for getting rid of big tech. And then I've got a novel in November called The Lost Cause. That's a post-Green New Deal novel about counter-reformation against a movement to really help the climate and do something about it, composed of white nationalist militias and anarcho-capitalist seagoing wreckers living on a fleet of renovated aircraft carriers. And then the next book is the sequel to Red Team Blues. It's called The Bezel. It's about prison tech, and it comes out in February. And then I've got a graphic novel for middle grades readers based on my novella Unauthorized Bread, and then a short story collection, a collection of Little Brother short stories, and then the 3rd Martin Hench novel, which is called Picks and Shovels. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
For more debates, talks, and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.